Welcome to NightCAP. It's November 16th.
Time for your weekly dose of commentary, analysis, and politics.
I'm Fallon Gallagher.
And I'm James Duran.
And tonight, Katie Dell is back with us at the round table, and we're also joined by Patrick Wohl, who has been published in The Hill, Washington Examiner, and the Daily Caller. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thanks for having me.
So Roy Moore, the GOP Senate candidate from Alabama, continues to face allegations of sexual misconduct with girls who are minors. The Washington Post first reported that a 32-year-old Roy Moore initiated a sexual encounter with a 14-year-old girl. Now there are at least 8 women speaking out against Moore, with 2 new accounts emerging yesterday. It seems D.C. may be the new Hollywood. Nearly all of the GOP establishment is speaking out against Moore. Senator Cory Gardner, the NRSC chair, released a statement saying that Moore is, quote, unfit to serve in the United States Senate. The Moore campaign continues to fire back, calling the reports fake news and telling Mitch McConnell to bring it on.
And Fallon, as much as we should applaud National Republicans for speaking out, I think the organization that actually could have done something about this, the state party down there in Alabama, decided not to last night. They held a meeting basically for this purpose, and reports are that they discussed it, but it did not even get to a vote. So certainly disappointing that they weren't able to step up to the plate on that.
Well, let's dig into this. Katie Dell, the last time you were on, we were talking about how slim that GOP majority is in the U.S. Senate. So how significant do you think it is that GOP leaders are speaking out against Moore, that the NRSC chair, Cory Gardner, like I mentioned, is saying that Moore should get out?
Yeah, well, I think, actually, Fallon, I'm relieved and proud that they're putting partisanship aside for a greater issue of, abuse of minors. When you have people like Gardner and Mitch McConnell coming out and saying, we're taking a hard line on this, we don't want him in the Senate, as ineffective as it is because he's not a current senator, it makes me proud of our Senate as a whole.
Yeah, and Patrick, I think one of the other takeaways from this was the fact that there's been quite a bit of polling, some anecdotal evidence that really a lot of Alabama voters are willing to write this reporting off as the liberal Washington Post, the Amazon Washington Post, whatever you want to call it. I mean, what does that say about our politics that we've gotten to a point where that is the reaction to such corroborative reporting on something so devastating?
Sure. Well, I think we've seen kind of a degradation of trust in the media in the last few years. And we've also seen in Alabama that they really have a problem ultimately with some of their elected leaders. We saw earlier the love gov in Governor Bentley, who resigned earlier this year and made a fool of the state there. And now they have what some are calling the predator senator. So they really have a problem with some of the leaders that are going down there. And so I think the national GOP is taking it upon themselves to make the right moves.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Katie, one thing that we should be careful about here, there have been a lot of tweets and reporters commenting on some polling that, to what Pat's talking about, Alabama certainly has some issues, but they're taking a little bit too far, I think, in taking these polls that say, are you more or less likely to support Roy Moore based on the Washington Post reporting, da-da-da-da. And I think what's really difficult with that polling, and something that we should keep in mind, is that question essentially boils down to partisanship, right? I mean, that is a question that it could very well say, do you support Roy Moore more or less since the Washington Post reporting that he wears a clip-on tie, right? And you would see similar numbers because the way that gets internalized is really just, yes, I support Roy Moore. Right. Of course I'm going to still vote for him, or no, I don't support Roy Moore, and I believe the Washington Post. So I think it's a little bit difficult, and we should be careful on that. That said, there was a poll out today, and actually, if you want to read more about that, Nate Silver has written quite a bit on that subject. But there was a Fox News poll out tonight, showing Doug Jones leading Roy Moore 50-42 with Jones, plus 26 with women. So Fallon, I think that's really what we're seeing. Degrading his lead and really showing him down in some of the more recent polls is that he's hugely underwater with women now. So
definitely, and I want to actually circle back to the actual journalism of that Washington Post report, the one that brought this story to light. Katie Dell, we saw some really high quality journalism there. They followed every single rule in the book. They followed a lead. They were very careful with their sources. I want to note that none of the women actually sought out the Washington Post. The Washington Post found them. They've conducted dozens of interviews that could corroborate these stories. So how is it possible that anyone can not believe this reporting?
And it's tough, Fallon. When I read the main article, I was struck by the amount of corroboration of the story there was. I think for for people not to believe the Washington Post is entirely partisan, like James was saying, it's this fake news phenomenon that's actually driven by our president, who has been silent on this. Our loudest president ever has said nothing, which I think when asked about it, he mentioned that he doesn't watch a lot of TV and he's been busy in Asia, which yes,
but
he
he
has.
tweeted about CNN and Fox and Friends supposedly knowing what his trip was going to be.
Exactly. The distrust in the media, even in such solid journalism, is frightening, and it's a result of this climate that we're in, where there are a lot of different stories going around.
Well, and you know, he yesterday after he gave his speech, he was silent. The reporters were yelling questions at him. What do you think about this? What's your take? And nothing. And how much of that do you think that's because he's had his own personal history with this? You know, we saw the Access Hollywood tape. What do you think about that?
What's striking about that is I'm surprised that since he has had his own personal history with this, he wouldn't take this time to come out. But again, it's just this like severe partisanship that we keep seeing, and I'm thankful, like I said earlier, that Mitch McConnell and Gardner and the leaders of the GOP within the Senate aren't staying silent. But I think that I think President Trump doesn't know what to do with this. I think that what's curious to me is that I wonder what his reaction would have been had it been a Democratic senatorial candidate, which is interesting because of what's just come out about Franken. I don't know.
Yeah, we'll see how he responds to that versus Roy Moore. And so, you know, if it isn't enough that I want to move on here a little bit, if it isn't enough that Alabama voters sort of don't buy this Washington Post reporting, Steve Bannon, we saw, is now essentially weaponizing his website, Breitbart, sending 2 reporters down to Alabama with the explicit purpose of poking holes in the story. And, you know, I think worth noting that Roy Moore, Pat, is another Steve Bannon classic in terms of candidate selection. Along with convicted felon Michael Grimm in New York 11. It's almost like Republicans have 2 exceptional committees whose job it is to pick good candidates and support good candidates who aren't, say, ex-cons or, reportedly, doing predatory behavior toward minors. And last I checked, Steve Bannon wasn't responsible for our successes in 2018 and even having a Senate majority in the first place. You talk about some of the places that the NRSC pulled wins out of. Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, places that people like us had already written off. So, it would be nice if he could get out of the way. Maybe, Pat, our party could hold on in 2018, but not looking like it.
Well, I think he feels a little emboldened because of the win from Trump, but it's important for people to remember that, even though he was on top of the campaign, and I think the CEO was his official title, which is not something that I had ever heard for a campaign, but regardless, he's not really a campaign person. This isn't his domain. He's a media person, he's a banker, but he feels emboldened because of the Trump win, and he really needs to step up his vetting of these people, because ultimately if you're putting them forward and we don't know their backgrounds, you're just going to hurt the party, and he's going to ruin that already thin Senate margin.
Well, and the other thing with the party is it seems that we've been seeing a lot of like a big women's issues with the party. And Katie, I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about this because just over a week ago we saw Ralph Northam came in. We were talking about Virginia Gov on here a lot, and he really brought up the score with women. I think he was actually performing better than Hillary Clinton did in that same area. So we've also seen all of these Republican leaders come out against Moore. But do you think that this situation with Moore in the South is still going to add to the GOP's image problem with women?
Well, absolutely, Fallon. I think that there's no way that it can't. I think this climate, we're seeing it in Hollywood, we're seeing it in politics. I think that women, we talked about the Me Too campaign a few weeks ago when I was on here, I think that women are really coming out against this kind of behavior that in the past has been kind of hidden in secrecy. I think that the GOP has had a lot of imaging problems with women. I don't want to generalize about women because I do know that 53% of white women did elect Trump, which is not
probably another discussion.
Exactly, another discussion.
For another
but
show.
I think that they're going to have to really stick with the messaging of those GOP Senate leaders if they want to have a chance and really think about a lot of their social positions.
Certainly, and I just really want to take a second to nail down how important these women voters are to our viewers at home. It's a fact that women are better voters than men. In every presidential election since 1980, more women have voted than men. So now we know it's possible for a Republican to win by scoring big with men. We saw it last year with Trump, a candidate who had already had an issue with women, one that only got bigger after that Access Hollywood tape that I mentioned earlier. But nevertheless, alienating women is still not a winning strategy for these candidates. So knowing all these things, James, the Washington Post allegations against Moore and the pattern of women's voting recently, can we still actually expect these women voters in Alabama to turn out and vote for Roy Moore?
Well, unfortunately, I think the answer is yes. I mean, we were texting about this last week when it came out, but 4 weeks is not a lot of time. I mean, it seems like there's signs now that they're going to be able to get the word out enough based on that Fox News poll, for example, but 4 weeks is not a lot of time to sort of transmit something so significant. I mean, we saw the extreme example of Greg Gianforte in Montana. That happened the night before, and of course there are some Montana-specific factors, a lot of early voting, a lot of mail voting. So I think it's still too early to tell, but unfortunately it does look like when you look at the polling of media trustworthiness that we have a longer track record of, and we can trace the trend line of that. I'm afraid this definitely is not a shoo-in for Doug Jones, even though I think it's fair to say it probably should be. So, if Roy Moore does hang on, I think it seems pretty clear from Mitch McConnell's history on the issue. We were talking about this, his role in forcing out Senators Larry Craig and Bob Packwood, both of whom were also Republicans, and I think one, or if not both of whom, they lost those seats because of that. And so certainly, and the New York Times has some good reporting on that if you're interested in that history. But important to note that Mitch McConnell does seem to be willing to make the hard call here and put this above above politics. So Patrick, if we assume for a minute, beyond the write-in options like Jeff Sessions, if we assume for a minute that Roy Moore does win and the Senate opts to expel him, there have been, Susan Collins has said that not seating him isn't really an option. They would have to really do the expulsion vote. What would that do for the sort of geographic fissures that we're seeing, the deep-seated skepticism that Washington tends to engender in places like Alabama?
Sure, I think it'll just make it even greater in some ways, which is maybe just a price that we have to pay. I think ultimately your leaders and those in Washington, the leadership, McConnell and others, have to act as greater role models than others may, people like Roy Moore. So I think that is ultimately the price that they may just have to pay. But one thing I would like to just note quickly is I think we need to be consistent in how we criticize Republicans and Democrats for it, because I know we talked about earlier how the GOP has a woman problem, but it really is not just Republicans or Democrats doing these kinds of things. Like you said Al Franken, and I think there's a conversation now about Bill Clinton and whether or not his sins should be forgiven, if it was okay for the party for decades to basically destroy the women who had terrible accusations against him, whereas everyone is believed now. So I think that is a new conversation that people are having now. You saw the other day there was a Vox piece, which is not a conservative publication by any means, with the title "Bill Clinton Should Have Resigned" by Matt Iglesias. So I think we need to be consistent, and that goes to people trusting articles like that, like the Washington Post piece. We have to be consistent in calling out both Republicans and Democrats, and party leaders need to do that as well. And
that's a great point. I'd like to leave it on that note. We will be right back after the break. More NightCAP.
At Northwestern, we're Wildcats in every way.
Cheer you all to go. Go you Northwestern, fight for the sweet victories, for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
And President Trump is just back from his 12-day trip to Asia. Yesterday, he gave a speech proclaiming America's return as a global power, though it lacked substance and policy proposals that he promised.
Yeah, so Katie Dell, the much anticipated announcement yesterday wasn't very newsworthy. I think the water moment may have been what the network spent the most time on afterwards. But is it enough for his supporters? I mean, we talk to Trump supporters occasionally, and it seems like sometimes it's enough just for him to look presidential, basically to show up for the job and remind him that he's out there doing presidential things like taking trips overseas, even if it is sort of just a book report of the entire itinerary of the trip spelled out. Is that enough for his supporters to just sort of be there and be that presence in front of the camera?
Well, yes and no, James. I think that in the short term, it is enough. I think people are like, look at him up there. He's doing a great job. I think come 2020, come the next election cycle, when what he said during his campaign and what's actually happened are juxtaposed and scrutinized by the media, I think then some of his flip-flop voters, people who may have voted for Obama because of dissatisfaction, voted for Trump, might flip back if they have not been satisfied. I think his core base is gonna stick with him, but I think that there's some middle ground that in the future it's not going to be enough just for him to be a figurehead who looks presidential.
Yeah, I mean, Pat, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, it seems to me, as someone, as people who are concerned with policy outcomes, it seems to me that there's very little to sort of hang your hat on if you're the White House. And so how do they balance that in terms of, maintaining that rapport with the base, like Katie says, when in reality, so far, the only thing we've got is Supreme Court Justice Merrick Garland. Excuse me, Supreme Court Justice. Wow, Freudian slip there. Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch.
Yeah.
How do they balance that?
Well, I think if you look at it through the lens of a Trump supporter, that he is delivering victories. You're pulling out of trade deals. You're renegotiating NAFTA, even if we're not really. You're not going to be in deals like Chorus. He announced the other day that the United States isn't going to be in these multilateral trade deals. He's going to do everything one-on-one. So I think if you look at it through the lens of a Trump supporter, he is winning, and your head probably is spinning, like he said in the campaign.
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize that. I mean, while a lot of us, disagree with the economics of it, what you just mentioned, this is what Trump ran on, pulling out of multilateral trade agreements that, are difficult to disentangle, not pursuing TPP, and so on and so forth. Pat, just to continue on that, is the media struggling to grapple with that, to properly cover this, given the types of experts that we see talking about issues like trade on TV?
Yeah, I think they probably don't recognize it as necessarily an accomplishment and sort of laugh off the things that he's doing. I think that's probably a good thing because some of the—
For Trump.
Well, for Trump, yes,
Right.
because anything, anytime the media criticizes him, it really only makes the base stronger and like him more. So I think there needs to be more of a debate, though, among analysts and the public about where the party wants to go in terms of trade, because that's the important thing going forward.
Well, I want to go back to what you said about the media. Who do you want to see coming on to talk about trade? Who's your ideal guest?
Well, I think it's difficult because, for the longest time, and we're going to get into this in a minute here,
are we?
as Pat and I were discussing before the show, this is not the Republican Party that we grew up in, right? With protectionism, with non-interventionist foreign policy or bordering on isolationist foreign policy. So we're going to get into that, I think, in full. But in terms of people who you should have on TV, I don't think it's necessarily as much of a matter as finding a protectionist to come on TV. I'm sure there are plenty of those folks out there. It's more just sort of the tone I think it takes with. You see sort of Richard Haas on Morning Joe all the time. You see sort of Steve Ratner and the likes of those folks who have been steeped in sort of free trade international, trade deals and multilateral trade deals, which, to be honest, it's difficult to look at and see tangible benefits if you're a voter at home. So I think it's just a tone and a body language issue more than it is booking more protectionists. But I'm sure there's a lot of different opinions on that. But to that, what we were talking about, the fact that protectionism is now apparently a part of our, of our party, Pat. I mean, how did we get here? This is one of the things that I took away from this election. I just can't quite figure out. I mean, I understand why it is persuasive, but talk a little bit about how we got to this point where the Republican Party decided it was worthwhile to embrace protectionism.
Sure. I think people have for a long time seen jobs disappearing in different places, and you see it's kind of a simple solution to say that free trade has caused your job to go away, and I don't think the party has done a good enough job explaining how it has benefited us as a country, how we've transformed from a different, more of a manufacturing, less of a manufacturing sector than we were in the past. I think the party needs to do a better job explaining what free trade is, how it benefits our country, and why that is a principle that we believe. And I think an easy example is just looking back at history. One of the biggest tariffs that was slapped on, foreign tariffs that was slapped on goods coming to the United States was the Smoot-Hawley tariff at the end of the after the turn of the century.
Right.
And people thought for a long time that was going to solve our problem. It really was ultimately the country's downfall before the Depression. So I think they need to do a better job explaining.
Yeah, I think that paycheck calculation is something that we haven't been able to properly message. The fact that goods are cheaper because of a lot of these trade deals, right? That whether the goods are the same or not, the products that go in are less expensive when we have sort of freer trade. But Katie,
Yeah, let's bring Katie back.
we touched on realignment.
Long time no see.
We touched on realignment the last time you were on, in terms of a different topic. But is this another one? Are we seeing another potential realignment whereby Democrats become the party of free trade, or is this just sort of muddled at this point?
I think that could happen, James. I think there's like a vacuum there, definitely. I heard a speech from Joe Biden a few weeks ago at Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and he was definitely espousing a free trade interventionalist foreign policy, and that was very interesting to me because he's startled by the kind of protectionist message that is being espoused.
Real quick, not econ question for you. After that speech, do you think Joe Biden's running in 2020?
Big time. Oh yeah, definitely running.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for this segment. If you like the conversation, you should follow us along on social media at NightCapNU. And if you really like the conversation and you want to come join the show like these two, shoot us a message. We'd love to have you. More NightCap after the break.
At Northwestern, we're Wildcats in every way.
Go Northwestern, break right through that. With our colors flying, we will cheer you all to go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, spread for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
Welcome back. So we're going to bring this block a little bit closer to home. In this increasingly polarized political landscape, we've heard a great deal of discussions around dialogue on college campuses. Northwestern was in the news last week in conservative circles, with a professor tweeting about how the Republican Party and the NRA want mass shootings because it, quote, serves their interests. The professor has since apologized and deleted his Twitter account. But we still want to talk a little bit more about this.
Yeah, so Patrick, I don't want to focus too much on this one instance because, of course, as Fallon mentioned, the professor has since apologized and retracted his comments. I actually didn't know that he had deleted his Twitter.
Yeah, whole Twitter's gone.
But for those who aren't as immersed in this topic or maybe don't understand what it's like, this is not a Northwestern specific issue. I know you've dealt with it. I mean, talk a little bit about the dynamics of being a conservative, a Republican on a college campus and sort of the silencing effect that tends to occur there.
I think the best way to look at it is just look at the professors on campus. I think the number is 12-1 is the number of liberals to conservatives or professors who self-identify by those ideologies. So if you're a student on a college campus, you go to get educated and exposed to different ideas, but chances are you could graduate with a whole political science degree and never have a professor who's a conservative or who disagrees with you in any way. So I think ultimately it goes to sort of the bubble that's been created on college campuses, and people need to recognize that more.
That's remarkable. Katie, do you think that this is a problem, that free speech should be encouraged at colleges and universities regardless of your politics, or are James and Patrick sort of overstating this whole issue?
I tend to agree, Fallon, as a left of center student. I think that I definitely see that there is a liberal consensus on our campus. It's really the only one that I can speak to. I think that sometimes even in small discussion classes, it might be uncomfortable to espouse views that are contrary to almost everyone else in the room, from what you can see, whereas liberal students feel very comfortable almost taking a bit of a moral high ground.
I would say that with one exception. Have you ever had a poli-sci class with him?
I have not, but I hope I do before I get to
It's pretty aggressive.
Stay tuned. No, I mean, I think Katie brings up a great point, and it's not across the board, and I think we should be careful. Northwestern is not Berkeley, right? It's not sort of this is a fairly innocent sort of situation that happened, but I think the point here really is it's not about people like me. It's not about people like Patrick who are, if I can say, fairly confident in their ability to articulate conservative viewpoints.
Oh, is that what you are?
Thank you.
I'm speaking for
Okay.
both of us here on PAT.
Okay. Are you confident in articulating your
I'm
points?
confident.
My
Okay.
point being,
Thank you.
what it's really about, the people that it's really about are the ones that, are maybe not as willing to speak up when that time comes, like Katie mentioned, in in small sections where you're expected to talk. When we have classes that are taught about the American presidency, I mean, it is impossible to divorce your political ideology from a topic like that.
Certainly, I don't disagree.
In a class where you are required to talk for, credit. So I think that's the thing to keep in mind is there are certainly, even here, I would assume, plenty of students who feel like they maybe can't articulate some of those things or would rather not. And so I don't think that is a positive effect. I don't think that's what college should be for. But
All right,
nonetheless,
well, we could talk about this all day, but we want to jump to one of our favorite segments. What did you guys miss this week? Our roundtable will let you know in case you missed it. Katie Dell, what do you got for us this week?
So Greg's is a British bakery.
Okay.
They release an advent calendar every year around the holidays. Advent is the time before Christmas.
We all know
so
you're a
all
nice
know.
Catholic gal.
It's true. And they do funny pictures in each of their calendar days. And
Okay.
one picture was a nativity scene, but instead of having a little statue of baby Jesus, they had a sausage encased with a little bit of dough. And people on Twitter, Christians, were freaking out, saying, this is disrespectful to our Lord. This is wrong. You would only make fun of Christianity and no other religion. They
seems
did not
wrong.
remove it. They apologized, though.
Oh, so they're confident too.
They probably just made a lot of them.
so you're really on this beat. I mean, last time
Last
you
time
talked
you-
about
I-
the corn pops thing. I mean,
I'm hungry.
apparently, I mean,
Did you eat dinner?
No.
just finding out all kinds of mess ups by food companies.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
guess, but-
Katie Dell, you're going to hold them accountable. I could give you a job. That's where I'm interning right
Oh,
now.
please do.
All right, Patrick, what do you got for us?
I'm going local. We were talking about national politics. One little nugget here in Illinois. Governor Rauner has a primary challenge, which no one was expecting, and she is holding a fundraiser this week. And actually, one of the people in attendance is going to be Virginia McCaskey, the owner of the Bears. So it's going to be an interesting fight. I don't think she stands a chance, but we will see. And I'm rooting for the Gov.
It would be nice if Virginia McCaskey could focus on the Bears.
Yeah,
given
that
how
would be good
terrible
too.
the
Yeah.
Bears are. Mine this week, unfortunately, going to take it back to local politics. Pat, guy we used to work for, Senator Rand Paul, back in the office, back in the Senate this week, and good to see. Obviously, sustained some pretty serious injuries with an altercation with a neighbor. And I think one thing we were talking about offline was the tone of the coverage of that incident. I mean, make no mistake, I think anyone can look at that story and think that there's more to it, that we're not getting the whole story. But at the end of the day, the number of articles I saw along the lines of this story is getting weirder and weirder. Just report the facts. Just tell me what happened to a senator in his own backyard. And frankly, there are not many details that can justify a grown man tackling another grown man in his own backyard and breaking ribs. So
Do you have a hot take on what you think actually went down?
I think there was probably a debate over property lines or something that Senator Paul is passionate about, but maybe it was just about raking leaves. Who knows?
All right, well, I finally get to give mine in case you missed it. So there's this article in the New York Times, and it wasn't a political article. It was on the front page, and it was about Walmart. And I was like, that's interesting. Did you know that you can park your car and sleep overnight in Walmarts? There was this whole article. It was mostly pictures. It was truly remarkable. If you want like a nice insight into what is going on in this country outside of the bubbles that we live in, I highly recommend that you check it out. Honestly, I would have liked a little bit more context and a little bit more reporting, but I think that they could come back and do a whole series on it because I thought it was.
Fallon, you can just go to the nearest Walmart parking lot at night if you want more reporting.
But it's still
we're
going to be
planning
in
on
our
it tonight.
bubble.
Right.
Should we go to Walmart later?
Let's go.
Let's sleep over? Let's check it out.
Can't wait.
All right. Well, and if you, some more audience interaction, if you guys have something great that we missed this week, you can also tweet at us at NightCapNU. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have this week. We want to thank Katie and Patrick again for joining us. It's always a blast.
We're off next week for Thanksgiving. Enjoy the time with family, and we'll be back live November 30th with more NightCap. Good night.